My name is Sebastian Harrison. I'm with the Center for Creative Land Recycling. We are the Brownfield Technical Assistance Provider for DTSC and the ECRG grant. Really here to help you through every stage of the ECRG process. Again, we really appreciate your attendance. This is the next webinar in the ECRGenius applicant series dedicated to the ECRG Eligibility Self-Check Tool. And so before I hand it off to Mariam Tasnif-Abbasi and Tris Chesney with DTSC's Office of Brownfields, we'd just like to begin with a couple of poll questions so that we can understand who's joining us today. And for the first one, if you have multiple applications that you're considering, you should be able to select a couple different answers. But again, just curious, what are the types of projects that you're considering? And again, do you own the site that you're applying for ECRG? Because that is an interesting aspect of this grant, that you don't have to own the site. You just need to show that you have access and the ability to perform the ECRG activities on the site. So just going to give it 1 minute for folks to respond. Great, thank you. And Helen and Lujane, whenever you have a chance in just a minute, if you could share the poll results with us, that'd be excellent. Okay, great. So a lot of site cleanups. That's similar to what we saw for round 1 of the program. If you're pursuing a site cleanup, it's strongly recommended that you have an approved cleanup plan, or you're working towards a regulatory approved cleanup plan, so that there's some confidence behind the work that you're planning to perform. And then later, the second question, it seems like there's a real mix of folks that either have site ownership or don't have site ownership, but will then have to show that they have the ability to perform the ECRG activities, like I said. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mariam Tasnif-Abbasi to begin the presentation. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, and thank you everyone who've joined us today. We're really excited about launching our eligibility self-check tool. During the last round of ECRG, because it was a new grant for us, we ended up doing a pre-qualifying application process, and we heard everyone talk about how useful that was for them. And so in response to the feedback we received, we're launching this self-check tool. So I want to also say thank you to Tris Chesney, who's joining me today to help out with today's presentation. She, along with our Office of Legal Counsel, has taken the lead on developing this checklist that we're going to be talking about today. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant, just a really broad view of this, we are currently in round 2 of 3 rounds. Last time we granted about $75 million. We have approximately $100 million to grant out this time. Basically, this program is one that incentivizes cleanup and investment in disadvantaged communities. And the grant is open to public entities, nonprofits, and tribes to conduct community-wide assessments, site-specific investigations, and site-specific environmental cleanups. It's an online and competitive process. Next slide, please. So what is this self-check tool? Our guidelines are not coming out until later on in December, and our application is not actually going to be released until January. But based on our experience last time, we understood that putting the information together for the application takes time. A lot of thought goes into it. And so we released this tool so applicants can understand if they are eligible to apply, if their site might be eligible to apply. It provides a list of documents needed. And what we're really hoping it does is help you plan ahead and create like a good foundation for your ECRG application. The self-check tool comes with very detailed instructions that really answer a lot of questions and help you kind of deep dive into this aspect of predetermining your eligibility. Next slide, please. I did want to point out sort of what the eligibility self-check tool isn't. It's not something that's going to be submitted to DTSC. It's purely for your planning purposes. It's not a formal part of the ECRG application process. It's not required when the application opens up to have completed this self-check, and it doesn't provide any benefit or scoring advantage. And I did also want to point out that this is preliminary. We don't have our guidelines out yet, and the application isn't developed. It's under development as we speak. And so the way we ask the questions and the questions we ask for may not be a one-to-one sort of linkage with the application itself. Regardless, we do think it's a very important tool for those of you who are planners like myself and want to get a head start on accessing, up to $7 million. Next slide. So because the self-check tool really talks a lot about eligibility, I did want to provide some, basic ECRG eligibility, especially for those who are not familiar with our program. You have to be a public entity, nonprofit, or tribe. We will talk about what makes a site eligible, but the site needs to be eligible. This time we are switching to Cal and VirusScreen 4.0. Cal and VirusScreen is a database that is developed by another one of our state agencies that integrates demographic data with pollution burden data to come up with a score. And so because we are focused on disadvantaged communities, we use that Cal and VirusScreen database to understand which communities we want to target. So our primary focus is for areas that have a score of 75 or above. And if you're in a lower score area, the reuse has to be for the primary benefit of a vulnerable community or population. Regulatory oversight for investigation and cleanup grants is required. You have to own or have access to the site. We have to see that our applicants have a vision for reuse. Depending on where you are in the stage, whether if you're in community-wide assessments and that's where you're looking at, those are sort of early entry into the ECRG program. And then more advanced, if you get to the cleanup aspect and that's what you're applying for, there's a little bit a greater lift, I think, for having a better idea of what your reuse plans are going to be. Community engagement is really important to us. Meaningful community engagement, innovative community engagement, and different ways to include the local population in decision making is important. And so we want to have, as a requirement, a well thought out engagement approach. And we have broad flexibilities for tribes. We'd like to take our tribal applicants and work with them on a case-by-case basis, understanding that they have very unique circumstances. And the owner of the site has to have a CERCLA liability defense, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in some detail. So very broadly, I know that I myself have taken, it's taken me a long time to understand what a CERCLA liability defense is. And I wanted to create this slide just to summarize it. The bottom line is our applicants and our grantees cannot be liable for the contamination. Now, how do we define that? How do we measure that? Well, we look to CERCLA, or the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, where there are very specific requirements on how to establish a defense and establish that you aren't, in fact, what we call the responsible party or the party responsible for causing the contamination. Very, very broadly, what we're looking at are that our applicants did not cause or contribute to the contamination. They didn't own the site while it became contaminated. They're not affiliated with the party that caused the contamination. When they owned the site, they protected it from becoming contaminated. For example, if you have a site that is undeveloped and you did not put a fence around it to protect the site from illegal dumping, for example, then that becomes a complication. And you should have conducted due diligence or all appropriate inquiries, also referred to as AAI, before purchasing the site. And that's one, I think, where there's a lot of depth to each one of these aspects. And so I think one of the biggest sections in our self-check tool really goes to helping the applicants or prospective applicants establish their CERCLA liability defense. The terms that we use, sometimes interchangeably but have different nuances to them, are CERCLA liability defense, conducting due diligence, all appropriate inquiries, and I think sometimes you'll hear bona fide prospective purchaser or bona fide purchaser. And so these all are different terms with different nuances that may mean different things, but all sort of contribute to the language that we use when we're talking about having a CERCLA liability defense. I wanted to also share this slide because Tristan and I were talking about entry points into the ECRG. Some are more complicated than others. And so, what are the easiest scenarios to be able to access ECRG funding? Tribes have very specific circumstances, so we will work with the tribes collaboratively on a case-by-case basis and bring them in with sort of a different type of application requirements. Community-wide assessments for us are really the easiest entry point into the ECRG. You don't have to own the site, you just have to have access. Preliminary envisioning of the reuse is enough because we understand it's very early in the stage. And if you own the site, you still have to have some preliminary reuse. But for the community-wide assessments, you don't have to have that CERCLA liability defense, which is sort of the more complicated aspect of eligibility. You have to have 4 sites. You can have more. And the idea is that conceptually, we would like to see you conduct these early stage investigations and community-wide assessments, and then hopefully move them into site-specific investigations for more funding in round 3. But community-wide assessments are really good entry into our ECRG. For site-specific investigations, the applicant has to have that CERCLA liability defense if they own the site. If they don't own the site, they just have to have access and some vision of reuse. Now for cleanup plans, I think that's when we require a heavier lift and we've got more requirements because our cleanup plans are the highest dollar figure. And this is where we go one layer deeper. So if you don't own the site and have access, the owner has to have that CERCLA liability defense. And that applies only for our cleanup grants. And of course, if you own the site, you do have to have the CERCLA liability defense. And I think the thing we're trying to show is that for the cleanup plans, that CERCLA liability defense attaches to the owner and the same way in the site-specific investigations.
Just clarify cleanup grants.
Yes.
You mentioned cleanup plans. So for clarification, she's talking about the site-specific cleanup grants.
Yes, sorry, that's exactly what I meant. Thank you. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Okay, so with that, let's, Anthony, if you can click over so we can do the walkthrough of the eligibility self-check tool. So this is the self-check tool. Anthony, if you can scroll down a little bit to the bottom of this page. And it's, actually, if you can stay on the bottom of the first page, please. Okay, here you go. You can stop right there. So the way this is supposed to be used is that we have set it up in a way that if all your responses are yes, then you should be eligible for the ECRG. If some of these answers are no, then you may not be eligible. And it's always really important, and we really are pressing hard on this, that if you answer no to one of these questions and are at a loss as to kind of how to still find entry into the ECRG from an eligibility standpoint, please make an appointment to meet with CClear, with Sebastian, and the other specialists that we have on board to help you with these circumstances. Is there anything else, Tris, on this?
And they do have, can use Calendly to contact CClear.
Yeah, And we have those links throughout the self-check tool just to make it easier for everyone to access. Okay, let's move on to the next page of the walkthrough. And these are just sort of like some of the more basic eligibility questions. So I'm going to breeze through these fairly quickly. There's applicant eligibility, and then in the right-hand side, those are the documents that are going to be needed for the application. And so these documents, we understand sometimes they take a while to gather, and we saw that in our last round. And so that's why we wanted to make it very clear as to what documentations are required to properly respond to these eligibility questions. For the Kallenmeyer screen score, we do have a tool that we will hyperlink into this self-check tool probably next week or so that you can kind of click on that and figure out exactly what your Kallenmeyer screen score is to help you prepare. For site eligibility, there are several types of sites that we aren't able to bring in, state of California owned and controlled sites, federal sites, sites with orders on them, or sites that have a RCRA permit or are under some sort of like DTSC permit for disposal, or Superfund sites. One of the things that we have changed this time is that there's a certain type of water board order that is allowable, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get further along in the checklist. So regulatory oversight is required for the site-specific investigation and site-specific cleanup grants. They're not required for the community-wide assessments, but if a community-wide assessment grant does want or has regulatory oversight, then it is an eligible cost. We are also asking that the applicant who we're working with be named on the voluntary agreement with DTSC or with the local oversight agency or with the regional board. And one of the newer processes that we're introducing this time is working with your regulator to get a project suitability letter. So we will be providing more information on that in the next couple of weeks.
And just for clarification, the project suitability letter will accompany any agreements or an investigatory order from an agency other than DTSC. So that would be a local oversight agency or regional board.
Thank you. Thanks for that clarification, because we don't need that for DTSC-led sites, but we do need that for local agency, regional board sites. And they've been working with us on this process collaboratively and are ready to issue these letters upon request. As I mentioned before, community engagement, meaningful community engagement is required. And that's broad right now because we really want to be open to different approaches. For our existing ECRG grantees, the drawdown requirement or the reimbursement request requirement is that invoices totaling 60% of the total awarded grant need to have been submitted by the 17th of March. That's just because we want to make sure that our grantees are in a position to provide the quality, time, and management needed, and we want to set everyone up for success, and so that's why we're requiring that total reimbursement request be submitted. We can skip through these attestations. There are a lot of attestations that are all kind of related to this overall context of working with non-responsible parties and non-polluters. And so these are the attestations that start contributing the building blocks to that CERCLA liability defense. And so the attestations about not being liable for the releases and having the documentation to be able to provide that when required is really important. And I'm going to actually skip through, let's go all the way down to this table. Thank you, Anthony. So this is another way of looking at when you are required to have that CERCLA liability defense. As you can see, we've broken this up by public entities, nonprofits, and tribes. And we're looking at owners and non-owners for the investigation grants and the cleanup grants. So for the public entities, if the applicant is the owner, then that CERCLA liability defense is required. It's not required if you're not the owner. What we hope to do is that when you're working with us under investigation grant, and most of the scenarios that we see is that it's a pre-acquisition work that needs to be done to get a better handle on the environmental uncertainties. The ECRG can pay for the all appropriate increase package, the phase 1, and the due diligence required to establish that CERCLA liability defense, and then hopefully you can apply for funding under the ECRG for the cleanup grant in the next round. And that's sort of the way we are envisioning movement from one type of grant to another. For the site-specific cleanup grant, whether you're a public entity or whether you're a nonprofit, the CERCLA liability defense will be required for both the applicant owner or the owner of the site if the applicant is not the owner. And for tribes, as I mentioned before, there's a different set of requirements, and we're going to address those on a case-by-case basis. And so under whatever circumstance you fall under, you then go ahead and move forward to Table 2. And these are just these are the instructions that give more depth to everything that we've talked about in that self-check tool. So, and then I'm going to have you kind of go through this. I'm not going to stop in these points because I think these are all self-explanatory for the applicant to go through. And let's see. Let's just, okay, I think we already talked about that. Community engagement, ECRG award, the attestations. And let's slow down here. Okay, here, this is where we're getting into the responsibility for contamination. Tris, was there anything that you wanted to say here?
No, not at this point. Just go ahead and go through it, and then if I've got any other.
Okay, great. So let's scroll down. And so let's stop over here for a second. So I think what we're going to walk through right now are the requirements for investigation and cleanup grants if the applicant owns the site. Let's go through. And that's where we talk about the different resources that are available to take a deeper dive and understand what that CERCLA liability defense means. Okay, here's Table 2. So Table 2 really for me is a good way to figure out like where you fall. So if you are a public entity, you have an exemption if you took title to the property prior to 2002. And that's where the grant deed ends up being necessary to be able to validate that. The next thing on Table 2 is sovereign authority. So this is basically for public entities who have involuntarily acquired a property. And under that circumstance, that's a different and I think a fairly clear and clean CERCLA liability defense. Now, the bona fide prospective purchaser, this is the one that is the one that I'm most familiar with, that I've seen most of the time. And basically, this is the situation where prior to taking title of the property, you were in a situation where you had completed your due diligence or your all appropriate inquiries. And we have the requirements to get a copy of the final phase 1 that shows us that the due diligence and the all appropriate inquiries was conducted in the manner that is required. And there's additional attestations that have to go with that. But we've seen this one be an issue sometimes, and there are some deep dives that one can do for this particular one. But if you have done your due diligence and the due diligence was based on what was customary at that time, because there's different types of due diligence and different bars depending on when you purchase the site. As long as the phase 1 is valid and qualifies, this is one that we see very commonly. Now, contiguous property owner and the innocent landowner defenses are ones that I'm not as familiar with. We don't see it that often, but Tris, working with legal, did lay this out in case it applies to any of our potential applicants.
And just to note, this information is provided so that it gives you additional information to be able to talk to your consultant and your attorneys to determine which one applies.
Yes, exactly. Because, you know, for some of the easier ones, it can be pretty straightforward. But I think for these ones, some additional consultation with your subject matter experts will be required. And so specifically for cleanup grants, when the applicant is not the owner, this is what I had mentioned earlier, that we go in a little deeper because we want to make sure that the property owner is not the polluter or the responsible party. And so all of the same questions and all of the same sort of various ways to establish that CERCLA liability defense. When you are coming into us with an application for a cleanup grant and you are not the owner of the site yet, you have to work with the party who is selling that property to you or the owner of that property and have them establish that CERCLA liability defense. And so these questions are, you know, we kind of put these questions in a little bit of a different way visually so that hopefully it can guide that conversation.
Hi, Miriam. Your sound is breaking up a bit unless it's just my speakers. So maybe you can repeat that last sentence.
Yeah, Miriam, you're breaking up real bad.
Okay, let me see what I can do. I'm going to turn off my camera and see if that helps.
That's actually better, Miriam.
Is it better? Okay.
Yeah, you're okay now.
Yeah, it was just funny for a second there. So we only heard like every other word when you started speaking about a minute ago.
Okay, I am going to try and repeat that. Basically, what I was saying is that for cleanup applications, we are going one deep, making sure both our applicant and the owner of the site are able to establish a CERCLA liability defense. And, you know, if you're working with an owner to get access, these are the questions that you will have to go through with them, and you understand the circumstances of their purchase of the property in order to come in. And I know this can be a little complicated, but one of the things that we wanted to do is create an avenue for non-owners to enter into the ECRG, but we still have to be very mindful about not giving this fairly significant amount of funding to situations where, you know, we're funding someone who's responsible for the contamination. And so that's why this was very important to us. And I think with that, we're towards the end of our instructions. And let's see. Yep, so this is the list of documents that are going to need to accompany the application when the application gets released in January. And we have, you know, we've got links and resources throughout the instructions, but we've got some additional resources over here since the CERCLA liability defense is based on CERCLA, and that's an EPA you know, owned process. We've got these additional, you know, links for you to take a look at. And so I know I skipped through a lot of this information. I just wanted to be mindful of our time, and I wanted to leave time open for questions. I also wanted to make sure that we all point out, like again and again, and I know Sebastian has mentioned this in the beginning, but as complicated as this may seem, we have free assistance for all of you to access. CERCLA has sort of like these office hours that they make available for any of you who are interested in learning more. And once you have a chance to go through this self-check tool, absorb it a little bit, write down your questions, and contact them. And you can have multiple free meetings with them to help them, to have them help you get to the point where you can plan ahead and hopefully be successful in getting a grant from us. This is our Brownfields Technical Assistance Provider team: Ignacio, David, Janet, Sebastian, who's been moderating today, Devin, Tony, Natalie, Helen, and Jane. And they're all here to help. They're here to get you organized. And I think their most important mission is to help DTSC get this $100 million out in the hands of the communities that really need them. Here are some additional links to our self-check tool. And once again, it's all about getting that free assistance. You can contact us at DTSC as well for specific questions, and use our webpage. We have a lot of resources on our webpage, latest news, other ways to kind of link to our previous webinar recordings, presentation slides, and announcements when we have new information available. And so I would encourage you to bookmark the DTSC's ECRG webpage on your computer, and visit that website for new information as often as possible, especially since we're going to be releasing the recording of this particular webinar. We're going to be releasing information on regulatory oversight and the project suitability letters, how to obtain that. And of course, there'll be updates on when our guidelines will actually be released, and what other content and ECRGenius webinars are going to be available once the application opens. So with that, Sebastian, we're happy to take questions if there are any.
Excellent. Before we start the questions, which if you have any more questions, please put them in the chat. We're going to address them in the order that they appeared. We'd just like to launch one more poll just to ask about your experience during the webinar. So Lujane, if you could launch that poll, to be very helpful.
Thanks, Sebastian.
Yeah, we just want to understand, do you have a better understanding of CERCLA liability defense? Because we know this can be new to some of your applicants, but really we want to help you understand, because again, that's a very important aspect of this grant. So please respond when you have time, and then we'll share the results in just a moment. While we're waiting on those results, I'm just going to begin with Neil Doran's question. He's wondering if a pre-purchase phase 1 is an absolute requirement for cleanup grants. And then with that, just an additional note, many municipal entities have legacy brownfield sites acquired many years ago without a phase 1.
Yes, and we understand that. And I think if you take a look at our self-check tool, there's a difference for public entities between post 2002 ownership versus pre-2002 ownership, and there are provisions for involuntary acquisition. And so I would say that's where the public entities need to take a look. So there's that exemption that I just talked about for historic acquisition, involuntary acquisitions. I think it's for the newer acquisitions post 2002 is when they are required to have some version of due diligence, because standards changed from 2002 to where we are now. And Sebastian, was there a second part to that question?
No, that was all of Neil's question. So again, it's not an absolute requirement. It does depend on when the entity acquired the site. And again, with regards to phase 1s and AAI, there's that very important 2002 date, which you can read more about in the instructions for the self-check tool.
Yes.
So just going to move on now. to Jake's question. Just give me a second to find it. Okay, Jake Shimano asked, how is eligibility affected if your nonprofit isn't the owner during the site-specific investigation, but is the owner during the site-specific cleanup?
Okay, that's a really good question. So that's one of the things that we were talking about like the pathway from investigation to cleanup. If you are the owner, as long as you have done your due diligence in the investigation and made sure that you work with us to get that all appropriate increase package prior to the time that you take title, then all other eligibility and competition requirements notwithstanding, you should be able to be eligible for the cleanup grant.
Thank you, Miriam. And before we move to the next question, just want to share that the vast majority of the attendees did achieve a better understanding of CERCLA liability defense. That's excellent to hear. To the applicants that responded no, if you do have any questions, regarding our understanding a bit further and how it impacts your sites, please do reach out or really access the self-check tool and check out some of the tables and instructions in there just to see if there's some more information regarding your scenario.
And Sebastian, thank you for saying that. And I would like to have more conversations with anyone who feels they want to learn more about this. And I know that we really took our time developing the checklist and the instructions, and we struggled with sort of shorter, more precise information versus deeper information. We went with deeper information because we felt that it was going to be helpful for people to understand the depth of establishing eligibility. But also I would take everyone to kind of start at table 1 and slide down and figure out where they are, sort of like the boxes that I talked about, owner, non-owner, what kind of grant, and see where you fall, and then try to kind of move forward from there. That might be a little bit less overwhelming if you focus your reading and your evaluation based on exactly what your circumstances are. Thanks.
Well
Sebastian.
said.
Ready
Yeah,
for the next question.
Instead of trying to understand, the entire landscape, just getting more specific about the site that you're considering for ECRG. Okay. So from Tessa, we actually have 2 questions, but one of them I answered in the chat because it was more straightforward. Can we apply to cover expenses already expended before a grant application? And I just responded, no, ECRG is for expenses incurred while you have an active grant agreement. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Miriam?
No, well said. That is the exact response for that question.
Okay, great. And then the second question here is, if the planned project on the subject site will be used for 100% affordable housing, does that count as serving a vulnerable population and take the place of the Coronavirus screen score of the 75+ requirement?
Generally, yes, because for that lower threshold, we are requiring, exactly what you said, Tess. And so the answer to that question is yes, that does count.
Okay, great. So that's all our questions from the chat. I just want to give everyone the opportunity, if you're still listening, please raise your hand and we can ask you to ask your question directly, or please put it in the chat. I'm just going to give it a couple minutes now to see if there are any, more questions in this group. And just as a heads up, go ahead, Miriam.
Oh, I was going to say, Sebastian, that if anyone who did ask a question has a follow-up, I'm happy to address those as well.
Great. I was just going to mention that these slides in the recording will be made available to this group and on the ECRG DTSC website sometime next week, when finalized.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's just give it till 10:42 then. And again, please just raise your hand if you have any question and we can ask you to ask it directly. But if not, we'll end the webinar, 15-20 minutes early.
That sounds good. I'm happy to have given everyone who signed up for our webinar some extra time in their day today.
Okay, great. Well, okay. Just one question in the chat regarding the website. The slides will be available. So that is just the DTSC ECRG new applicant resources page, and Lou Jane will share the link, or Helen in just a second there. But again, we really appreciate everyone's time in attending this meeting. And we're glad that most of you were able to learn some more about CERCLA liability defense and the eligibility aspects for round 2 of the ECRG program.
Thank you, Sebastian, for being such an incredible moderator. We really appreciate your navigating the questions and navigating us through the entire presentation. And I want to thank everyone for their time and their interest. And we hope to see all of your applications in round 2 when it opens up in January.
Excellent. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. And yes, Samira, that is where the slides will be. But again, not right away. I would check back mid next week. Okay. Goodbye, folks.